In the spring of 1958, in a farmhouse outside Chillicothe, Ohio, an 82-year-old man named Elias Caldwell asked his daughter to come closer. He had been fading for days. The doctor had stopped coming. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed against a light that wasn't there. But that evening, something changed. He became lucid, focused, almost desperate to speak. He took his daughter's hand and, in a voice barely louder than the wind against the window, he told her about the summer of 1897, about the mound on the Hopewell land, about what he and 11 other men dug out of the earth by lantern light, and about the men from Washington who paid them to bury it again and to never ever speak of it. What Eli Caldwell described in the last 3 hours of his life would not just challenge what we're taught about the people who built the mounds of Ohio. It would challenge what we're taught about who and what walked this continent before us. Eli Caldwell was not a storyteller. He was not a dreamer. By every account, he was the most ordinary man you could imagine. A farmhand, a fence builder, a digger of wells and graves, who worked the land around Ross County his entire life. He was 21 years old in the summer of 1897, strong, broke, and looking for work. That was the only reason he was there when they opened the mound. His daughter, Margaret, was 44 years old the night he confessed. She did not own a recorder. There was no tape, no film. But she did something that in the end mattered just as much. The next morning, while every word was still raw in her memory, she sat at the kitchen table and she wrote it all down. 11 pages in pencil, in a ledger she normally used for egg counts and feed bills. Then she folded the pages, slid them inside the family Bible, and told no one. That Bible passed from Margaret to her son, and from her son to a granddaughter, moving from house to house across 60 years, surviving a fire, 2 estate sales, and the slow forgetting that swallows most family stories whole. It was only in 2019, when the granddaughter finally opened the Bible to settle an inheritance, that the 11th pencil pages fell out onto the floor. She read them once and called a local historian. The historian read them twice and went quiet for a long time, because some of what Eli Caldwell described, things a semi-literate farmhand in 1897 could not possibly have invented, lined up detail for detail with documents that would not be written and discoveries that would not be reported until decades after he was already in the ground. If you're already feeling that pull, that sense that the official story has holes in it, big enough to bury something in, then subscribe now, because you're going to want to see where this leads. In an upcoming video, I'm walking through the actual Smithsonian field reports from the 1890s mound surveys, the ones that quietly list skeletons by the inch and then go strangely silent about where those measurements went. You won't find that breakdown anywhere else. For now, back to Eli. And the summer everything he believed about the ground beneath his feet stopped making sense. To understand why Eli stayed silent for 60 years, you have to understand the world he came from. Chillicothe in 1897 was farm country, church country, mind your own business country. The great mounds that dotted the Scioto Valley were simply part of the landscape. Grassy hills where boys sledded in winter and cattle grazed in summer. Everyone knew they'd been built by the old Indians, and almost no one thought any harder about it than that. Eli's family had worked that valley for 3 generations. His grandfather had helped clear it. His father had farmed it. Eli himself had dug more holes in that soil than he could count. Post holes, well shafts, root cellars, and yes, graves. Because in a small county, the man with the strongest back and the steadiest shovel ends up burying half the town eventually. He was good with the dead. That detail matters. Remember it. In June of 1897, a notice went up in town. A survey company out of the east was hiring strong men for excavation and earth-moving work on the Hopewell farm, where one of the largest mounds in the valley stood. The pay was extraordinary, $3 a day, more than double what a farmhand earned, plus a bonus at the end if the work was completed on scheduled strength and with discretion. Discretion should have meant something, but $3 a day silences a lot of questions when you're 21 and your boots have holes in them. Eli signed on with 11 other local men. When they arrived at the site, the first thing Eli noticed was that this was no ordinary survey. There were guards, 2 of them, armed, who never lifted a shovel and never explained why they were there. There was a fence going up around the base of the mound, canvas screened, so that nothing could be seen from the road. And there was a man in charge who was not a farmer, not a foreman, not anyone from the county. Eli only ever knew him as Dr. Brennan. He was thin, precise, and nervous in a way that put everyone on edge. He spoke with an Eastern accent. He carried a leather case of instruments he guarded like a newborn. And he had come, the men were told, on behalf of an institution in Washington, an institution he never named, but which paid in fresh, crisp bills that none of the local banks had ever circulated. Brennan gathered the 12 men on the first morning and laid out the rules. They would work in shifts, dawn to dark. They would report anything they found, anything unusual, to him before touching it. They would not discuss the work with their families, and they would sign a paper, each of them, promising silence. 3 of the men refused on the spot and walked back to town. The rest signed. Eli's signed. He told Margaret, 60 years later, that the moment he put his name on Brennan's paper was the moment his life divided into 2 halves. Before, when the ground was just ground and the dead stayed dead. And after, when he understood that some things had been buried on purpose by hands much older than anyone was willing to admit. They started at the top and worked down, the way Brennan instructed, slow, in measured layers, sifting the soil through screens. For the first week, the mound gave up what mounds give up: charcoal, ash, fragments of pottery, a few flint blades. Brennan logged each one, photographed it, and packed it in straw, routine, almost dull. But the deeper they went, the stranger the soil became. Eli had dug in that valley his whole life. He knew its clay, its sand, the way water moved through it. And about 15 feet down, the dirt changed into something he had no name for. A dense blue-gray layer, packed so hard the shovels rang against it, laid down in a way that felt deliberate, sealed. As if someone, long ago, had wanted to keep the lower chamber separate from the world above. It took them 4 days to cut through that sealed layer. And on the 4th day, just before dark, a shovel struck something that was not stone, not pottery, and not clay. Brennan ordered the lanterns lit, and the men kept working through the night. What emerged from the blue-gray layer over the next 3 nights was a chamber, not a grave. Eli had dug 1,000 graves, and this was no grave. It was a room, walls of fitted, flat stones, each one shaped and laid against its neighbor with a precision that made no sense for the old Indians they'd all been told built these hills. There was no mortar. The stones simply fit, edge to edge, so tightly that Eli couldn't slide the blade of his knife between them. In the center of the chamber, laid out with care on a low stone platform, was a skeleton, and it was wrong. Eli's first thought, he told Margaret, was that the men had somehow dug into an old circus burial, that this was some unfortunate giant from a traveling show. Because the bones were enormous, they laid a surveyor's rod beside it. The skeleton measured, from heel to crown, just over 8 feet. Brennan, his hands shaking, measured it 3 separate times and wrote each result in his notebook. But size, Eli said, was the least of it. The skull was the wrong shape. The forehead sloped back too far, the brow was a heavy ridge of bone, and along the top of the skull ran a raised crest, a ridge of bone like nothing in any man Eli had ever buried. When Brennan turned the jaw to the lantern, the men saw the teeth, a full set, and behind them a second row. 2 rows of teeth in both the upper and lower jaw, worn smooth and even, as though they'd been used for a lifetime. One of the men, a churchgoer named Hollis, dropped his shovel and would not come back down into the pit. He sat at the top of the mound the rest of that night with his hat in his hands, praying. There was more. Around the skeleton's brow lay a band of copper. Not a crown exactly, but a worked headpiece, hammered thin, set with discs of polished mica that threw the lantern light back in soft silver sheets. On the chest lay a sheet of mica cut into the shape of a hand with too many fingers. By the right hand of the skeleton, where a man might keep a tool, was a smooth black stone, perfectly egg-shaped, that Brennan would not let anyone touch with bare skin. He lifted it himself with cloth, and the moment it left the platform, Eli swore the air in the chamber changed, went thick and close and warm, though the night above was cool. Brennan spent the better part of a day alone in that chamber. The men could hear him through the canvas, measuring, muttering, sometimes a sharp intake of breath, once what sounded like a laugh that had no joy in it. When he came up, he was pale. He ordered the perimeter widened and the guards doubled. Over the following week, they found that the 8-foot skeleton was not alone. In a second, smaller chamber off the first, they uncovered 3 more. 2 were the same impossible scale. The third was smaller, child-sized, but with the same sloping skull, the same heavy brow, the same double rows of teeth in a jaw far too large for any human child. It was the small one that broke them, because a giant in a mound is a curiosity, a freak, a story you might one day tell. But a giant child, buried with care beside what could only be its family, meant these were not freaks at all. They were a people who had lived and raised children and buried their dead with copper and mica and worked stone. In the Scioto Valley, in chambers sealed beneath the mounds, long before the history anyone was taught had any room for them, Brennan documented everything. He photographed each skeleton from every angle with the large format camera, the powder flashes lighting the canvas walls from within like sheet lightning. He took dozens of measurements. He made detailed drawings in a separate locked notebook. He labeled the copper, the mica, the black stone, and packed each item in a wooden crate stamped with a single word the men could not read, because none of them could read much at all. But Eli remembered the shape of it well enough to draw it for Margaret on her kitchen table 60 years later. It was the seal of an institution in Washington. The bones went into long pine crates, packed in straw and sawdust. Eli helped build those crates himself. That was the work his strong back was for. He remembered the length of them exactly. He remembered that it took 4 men to carry the largest one. He remembered loading them onto a wagon under guard before dawn and watching them roll east toward the rail line at Chillicothe, where the men were told a special car was waiting. He never learned where they went after that, but he had a guess. They all did. When the last crate was gone, Brennan paid the men. It was far more than the contract promised. Each man received a sum that Eli said would buy a farm. Along with the money came a final warning, delivered without raising his voice. The institution in Washington would know if any of them spoke. There would be consequences for them and for their families. Then Brennan gave one last order. Fill it in. The chambers, the fitted stones, the empty platforms, all of it. The men spent 2 days shoveling the blue-gray clay back into the pit, collapsing the walls, erasing the room. When they finished, Brennan had the entire mound leveled and the ground plowed flat, so that within a single season, Corn would grow where the giants had slept, for who knows how many thousand years. The 12 men scattered. Some left Ohio entirely. Hollis, the churchgoer who'd prayed at the top of the mound, was dead within the year. Drowned, they said, in a creek he'd crossed safely 100 times. Eli stayed. He married. He had Margaret and 2 sons. He went back to building fences and digging wells and burying the town's dead, one ordinary grave at a time, for 60 more years. And he never said a word, not to his wife, not to his children, not to a single living soul, until the night the light came for him, and he decided the truth mattered more than the warning. Here's what turns Eli called deathbed confession from a folktale into something far harder to dismiss. A semi-literate farmhand in 1897 should not have known any of the specifics he described, and yet, almost everything in Margaret's 11 pencil pages can be matched against the public record. A record that, again and again, starts to describe exactly what Eli saw, and then goes quiet at precisely the wrong moment. Start with the newspapers. Across the late 1800s, dozens upon dozens of American papers, small town weeklies and big city dailies alike, carried matter-of-fact reports of giant skeletons unearthed from burial mounds. Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, New York, skeletons described as 7, 8, even 9 feet tall, skulls with heavy brows, and reported so often it became a pattern, double rows of teeth. Eli could not read those papers. He described the double rows of teeth anyway. Then there is the federal record. In the 1880s and 1890s, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology ran a massive, well-funded survey of the mounds, led by a man named Cyrus Thomas. Its official report, published in 1894, runs to over 700 pages. It is real. You can read it today. It catalogs mound after mound across the eastern United States, including the Scioto Valley around Chillicothe, the exact region where Eli says he dug. That report measures skeletons. It records chambers of fitted stone. It notes copper headpieces and sheets of mica laid on the chests of the dead. Every one of those details independently present in Margaret's pages. But the report draws a hard line. Officially, the conclusion was that the mounds were built by the ancestors of known native peoples and that the skeletons were of ordinary size. The giants, the 8-footers, the double rows of teeth, the sloping skulls that the newspapers had been reporting for decades, simply vanish from the official account, measured, sometimes, graded, sometimes, and then never spoken of again. Now do the arithmetic, the way Brennan's own paperwork forces you to. A standard burial excavation of that era shipped its finds in a handful of small boxes, pottery, blades, beads, light work. 1 wagon easily. Eli helped build long pine crates that took 4 men to lift. Crates sized not for arrowheads, but for bones 8 feet long. A single one of those crates outweighs everything a normal mound dig of the period would have produced in a season. The labor alone, 12 men, armed guards, a fenced and screened site, a private railcar, payments that would buy a farm, is not the budget of a routine archaeological survey. It is the budget of something a government very much wanted to remove and very much wanted no one to see. And one more thing. The Hopewell Mound Eli described, one of the largest in the valley, is gone. Leveled, plowed flat. Today, much of that land is ordinary field and roadway, exactly as he said it would be. The grassy hill that stood for thousands of years was erased inside a single year in 1897 by 12 local men who were paid never to explain why. For those who've never gone down this road, here is the uncomfortable shape of it. We are taught a clean and simple story about the deep past of this continent. One people, one timeline, one slow and tidy march from stone tools to the modern world. Anything that doesn't fit that line, Anything too large, too old, too sophisticated gets explained away as a hoax, a misidentified animal bone, an honest mistake by uneducated frontiersmen. But there is another reading, one that says the mounds of North America are not simple burial heaps at all, but the last visible remnants of an older world, a people who raised monumental earthworks aligned to the stars, who worked copper and mica with skill we still admire, and whose true scale, in every sense, was deliberately written out of the record. The giants fit this reading uncomfortably well. If a vanished people of unusual size once lived across this continent, then sealed stone chambers beneath the mounds make perfect sense. Copper crowns make sense. A giant child, buried with care beside its family, make sense. The decades of newspaper reports make sense. And so does the most disturbing part: the careful, well-funded, federally organized effort to gather those bones, ship them to a single institution in the capital, and let them disappear into a basement no member of the public will ever be allowed to enter. The most generous explanation is that it was honest science, correcting frontier exaggeration. But honest science publishes. Honest science does not need armed guards, canvas screens, secrecy oaths, and payments that buy a man's silence for 60 years. Honest science does not level the evidence and plant corn over it before the season is out. What Eli Caldwell described was not a study, it was a removal. Someone, somewhere decided that the people of the old world, the ones who slept beneath the mounds, crowned in copper, with 2 rows of teeth and skulls that don't match ours, were a story this country was not allowed to be told. Eli Caldwell died 3 days after he confessed. His daughter Margaret kept his secret for the rest of her own life. She never showed the pencil pages to anyone. Perhaps out of fear of Brennan's warning. Perhaps because, like so many who brush against this story, she simply didn't know what a person was supposed to do with the truth once it was in their hands. The pages survived her by more than half a century, folded inside a family Bible, waiting in the dark the way the bones once waited beneath the mound, until 2019, when they finally fell out onto a granddaughter's floor and refused to be buried again. And here is the part that should keep you up tonight. The Caldwells are not the only family with a story like this. Across Ohio, across the river valleys of the eastern United States, there are other grandsons, other granddaughters, other elders who whispered something strange before they died. Stories about mounds opened by lantern light, about bones too large to be ours, about quiet men from the capital who came and measured and crated and warned everyone to forget. The mound Eli helped erase is a field now. The chambers are crushed and buried. The copper crown, the mica hand, the smooth black stone, the bones of a giant child. If they still exist at all, they exist in a crate, in a basement, in Washington, behind a door the public has never been allowed to open. Mainstream historians will tell you none of this happened. That the giants were a frontier fantasy, that the double rows of teeth were a printing error repeated 1,000 times, that the mounds hold nothing the textbooks don't already explain. But errors don't require armed guards. Errors don't require secrecy oaths. And errors don't pay a poor man enough to buy a farm, just to make sure he never tells his children what he pulled out of the earth in the summer of 1897. The last gravedigger who buried the giants of Ohio is gone now, but his warning remains in 11 pencil pages in a daughter's careful hand. The ground we walk on is not as empty as we've been told, and the people who came before us were larger, in every way that frightens those who decide what we're allowed to remember, than the world will ever admit. Somewhere under the corn and the asphalt of the Scioto Valley, the chambers are still down there. The stones are still fitted, edge to edge, and whatever else they sealed beneath those mounds is still waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up and demand the answers we were paid so long ago to bury. If this reached something in you, subscribe. There are more of these confessions than you'd believe, and I'm releasing them one at a time. Next, I'm opening the Smithsonian's own mound reports, page by page, to show you exactly where the measurements stop. Watch that one next.